Well, hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very honored to have been asked to give the plenary lecture at this year's CDOGS conference. As you can probably tell, I am not giving this lecture live. I'm recording it the night before, but I am definitely here live, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions at the end of this talk. Before I start, I just wanted to thank Kat and Conrad for putting this together and for all of their work getting this organized. So I'm going to talk about, I'm going to give a big picture talk of the motivation for much of the research that I do and the research that is undertaken by my group. I'm going to talk about energy pathways through the ocean. And hopefully if you aren't too sure what that means right now, by the end of the talk, hopefully you will have an idea. So I wanted to start with this figure here. This is an observation of density throughout the Pacific Ocean from the north to the south of the Pacific along P16, which is a hydrographic line, a WOS line. And what you can see in color is density. So the surface of the ocean is relatively less dense in red. The deep ocean is denser, and that's in green. And the thing that I really want to point out here is that the ocean is stratified. This is probably not a surprise to any of you, but what this talk is about is why the ocean is stratified and what the implications of that stratification are. It turns out the fact that the ocean is stratified all the way to the bottom is really important, and it has really important consequences for climate. So let's take a step back and think about what could be setting the stratification of the ocean. One of the first things that we might think of is that the ocean is heated and cooled unequally at the poles compared to the equator, because the equator is closer to the sun, essentially. And so one question that you might have is, well, if you just took the ocean, if you just took a tank of fluid and you warmed and cooled it at the surface, would you set up a stratification that looks anything like what we see in the ocean? And so back in 1908, Johann Wilhelm Sandström set out to answer this question with a series of laboratory experiments. And so what he did was he took a tank and he arranged warming and cooling within the tank at different locations, and he looked at what circulation was set up and what stratification was set up. So the question that he's asking is, what kind of circulation and stratification is set up in the tank when you heat in one place and cool in another? And so I'm going to show you 4 different setups that he considered. In the first, consider a situation where we have warming at the surface of the ocean and cooling at the bottom of the ocean. So that warming at the surface of the ocean is going to reduce the density of surface water. That lighter fluid is going to sit at the top. The cooling at the bottom of the tank is going to cause that fluid to become denser and just sit at the bottom. And what happens in this case is you get a very strong stratification, but the fluid is completely static. There's no motion, there's no overturning circulation. The fluid is completely static. What about if you switch it around and you put the warming at the bottom of the tank and the cooling at the top of the tank? Well, in this case, we've got fluid being made lighter at the bottom, and that rises up to the surface, and we've got water being made dense at the top, and that sinks down to the bottom. And so we end up with this fairly vigorous overturning circulation. Hopefully that's fairly intuitive to all of you. What I think is a little bit less intuitive is a little bit more oceanographically relevant, which is when you warm and cool at the surface, which is kind of what we do in the ocean, right? So when you warm and cool at the surface, what Sandström found was that there is a very weak, shallow circulation that's set up, that's driven only by molecular diffusion. There's no deep stratification. What happens is the cool water that's generated, dense water that's generated by the cooling, just sinks to the bottom of the ocean and kind of fills it up in a homogeneous layer, a very thick homogeneous layer, and close to the surface you get a very thin thermocline that transitions that cold water to the warm water at the surface. there is this very weak circulation. There's very, very slow creeping flow that is basically driven by this molecular diffusion. However, what happens if you add a little bit of turbulence to the tank? So I've indicated that with these black eddies. So these are like little turbulent eddies that are spinning around and are mixing up the cold water and mixing down the warm water. And what you find in this case is that even though you're heating and cooling at the surface, once you add this mechanical mixing, this turbulent mixing, you develop a vigorous overturning circulation and a deep stratification. So you no longer have a deep homogeneous layer, you have stratification all the way to the bottom. And so what's kind of cool about this is that the circulation that's set up transports heat from the warming region to the cooling region, but it relies entirely on that external source of energy that's generating the turbulence in order for that heat transport to occur. So even though the heat itself is a form of energy, it's not driving the circulation. It's still relying on that external source of energy. And so this picture seems to be much more consistent with what we see in the ocean. It's much more consistent with the deep stratification that we see. So the analogy between Sandström's tank experiment and the ocean is that we have surface warming at the equator, cooling at the poles. In the winter, we have the formation of deep waters, the densest waters in the ocean, because we have large heat loss at the surface of the ocean, very strong winds, a lot of cooling. Those deep waters sink to the bottom of the ocean, and they are gradually returned via turbulent mixing towards the surface layer. Obviously, what I've said is a vast simplification. And in fact, what I've mentioned so far is only really talking about half, one of the two physical processes that drive the overturning circulation. But the point is that there is a vigorous overturning circulation in our ocean, and turbulent mixing plays an important role in it. To try and go into that in a little bit more detail, I want to show you the schematic from Lynn Talley, who's a professor at Scripps. And what she's done here is she's represented the overturning circulation through each of the main three ocean basins, the Indian, the Pacific, and the Atlantic, linked together by the Southern Ocean in the center of the screen around Antarctica. So the arrows are indicating the main movement of water, and the acronyms are referring to the different water masses. So for example, the AABW is the Antarctic bottom water. And I don't want to go into too much detail here, only to point out that there are these three components that I've talked about so far. So we have at high latitudes the formation of deep, dense waters that sink to the bottom of the ocean. And the way that those waters are returned, well, one mechanism is by the wind, which directly sucks that water straight up to the surface in a process. It's adiabatic, which means that the internal energy of that water doesn't change. That's not really what I'm talking about for the rest of this talk, but I wanted to mention it for completeness. The other part of the overturning circulation relies on diabatic mixing, and so that occurs in the deepest, or it's dominant in the deepest water masses, and it raises those deepest waters up into the adiabatic cell. And so both the direct wind driving of the overturning circulation and the diabatic, the mixing that contributes to the overturning circulation are really important, because together these form the meridional overturning circulation. And the meridional overturning circulation plays a really important role in global climate, because it transports a tremendous amount of heat between the equator and the poles. So what I'm showing here are some relatively recent results from Trenberth and Fasullo 2017. In the left panel, we're looking at the heat transport by the atmosphere and the ocean in red and blue as a function of latitude. And so you can see that the atmosphere and the ocean tend to transport heat away from the equator. That's what the black arrows are indicating. The heat is being transported away from the equator to high latitudes. The atmosphere transports about 2 times what the ocean transports. The ocean is transporting about 2 petawatts of heat And so understanding the sensitivity or the drivers of that heat transport is clearly important. We want to understand our climate. And what's really fascinating about this, and I kind of alluded to it before, is that although the overturning circulation transports 2,000 terawatts of heat, it relies entirely on external sources of energy. The heat itself does not drive the circulation. It relies on winds and it relies on mixing, turbulent mixing, and that turbulent mixing is not derived from the heat. It's derived from other sources. And so I'm going to talk about that in the coming slides. So the point is that that deep mixing requires energy. As I said, it does not come from the heat itself. Why does it require energy? Well, a turbulent eddy lifts denser water and it pushes down light water. And so that's what I've tried to show in the schematic to the right here. So the two red dots indicate fluid of different densities in the vertical. So the lower red blob is slightly denser than the higher red blob. It's stably stratified. And the green arrows indicate the motion of the eddy, the advection by this eddy in the vertical plane. So the eddy lifts up that lower, denser blob and it pushes down the lighter, less dense blob, and that requires an input of energy. In the end, the mixing associated with these turbulent eddies raises the potential energy of the ocean. It homogenizes it tends to homogenize the interior of the ocean, and because it's raising the dense fluid, it's raising the potential energy of the ocean. By looking at global profiles of stratification, Monk and Wunsch were able to estimate the amount of energy that is required to fuel that deep turbulence to sustain the stratification that we observe. And so they found that around 2 terawatts is required. So to give you a sense of what 2 terawatts is, well, 2 terawatts is comparable to the global electrical power generation in 2019, which turns out to be about 2.9 terawatts. It's much less than the total solar radiation that's incident on our planet, which turns out to be about 175,000 terawatts. And it's much less than the total heat transport by the ocean that I've already mentioned, which is about 2,000 terawatts. And so this huge heat transport by the ocean is a consequence of this relatively small amount of energy being input into the deep ocean. So where does that energy in the deep ocean come from? Well, one way to think about the ocean is that it's nothing more than a reservoir for different types of energy. So the ocean is an energy reservoir of kinetic, gravitational, internal, and chemical energies. It's largely steady. The amount of energy in that reservoir is largely steady, and energy is but work is being done all the time, and energy is being transferred into that reservoir all of the time. So work is being done by the winds, by the tide, by perhaps biological processes. Other things that can do work on the ocean could include things like buoyancy, so heat and salt flux at the surface of the ocean, pressure loading, work done by the atmosphere, and geothermal heating. That work would tend to increase the total energy of the ocean if it weren't balanced by a simultaneous dissipation of energy. So energy is being lost from the ocean at the same rate that it's being gained. That energy is being lost via turbulence and dissipation to heat, and some of that energy is being transformed to potential energy by mixing. The sources of oceanic energy that I've indicated on the left, of those 6 that I've listed, I'm really only going to focus on the first 3 that I've highlighted in green. The reason being that buoyancy, pressure loading, and geothermal heating are not thought to be terribly important. There are good reasons as to why buoyancy cannot really lead to turbulence in the ocean. Pressure loading and geothermal heating also do not tend to generate large circulations in the ocean. So I'm going to focus now on winds, tides, and biology, and let's understand how those processes can lead to turbulence in the ocean's interior. So the winds do work on the ocean at a rate of about 70 terawatts. Of that, most of that 70 terawatts goes directly into surface gravity waves, which are exactly the waves that you see if you stand on a ship and you look out over the ocean. You see these waves sloshing up and down, sloshing around, going up and down. That energy is of little consequence to the overturning circulation. Most of that energy actually ends up propagating to our beaches and dissipating at beaches around the globe. What is more important for deep mixing is the 1 terawatt that has been estimated to go into the general circulation. By the general circulation, I mean the large-scale wind-driven circulation. So the Gulf Stream, the Gyres, the Kuroshio, all of the western boundary currents, all of the large geostrophic currents that you see in the ocean. So that's a large reservoir of energy, but actually the rate at which energy is put into that reservoir is not terribly large, 1 terawatt. The winds also directly generate internal waves at the surface of the ocean. These are known as near inertial waves. It's a relatively small amount of energy, 0.1 terawatt, but it's important because those near inertial waves can propagate into the ocean's interior and can still lead to turbulence and mixing. And remember, we're only looking for 2 terawatts of energy in the deep ocean, so 0.1 is not completely negligible. How else does energy enter the ocean? Well, another prime candidate is the tides. The rate of working by the tides on the ocean is about 3.5 terawatts. That energy is thought to be, first of all, transferred to the barotropic tide, which is the tide that you observe when you go to the beach and you watch and you stand there all day and you see the sea level rise and fall over 12 hours. Most of the energy in the barotropic tide is dissipated in shallow seas just through simple processes of bond friction. They don't contribute to deep ocean mixing because it's not in the deep ocean and because boundary layers, turbulence in boundary layers may not be very effective at mixing the stratified interior. However, 1 terawatt of that energy in the barotropic tide is transferred in the deep ocean to internal tides. And so this is thought to be very important for ocean mixing because it's one of the few sources of energy in the deep ocean. And as I will show a little bit later, these internal tides can easily transfer energy towards turbulence. So the final thing that I wanted to talk about is the possibility that biology can drive turbulence in the ocean. And so depending on who you talk to, this may raise eyebrows. I don't know how seriously this is taken throughout the community, but the reason why I'm including this is because I wanted to emphasize that the energy budget of the ocean is far from closed. All of the numbers that I've presented so far, they're accurate to a factor of 2 if you're lucky. We really don't know. And so when we say we're looking for 2 terawatts in the deep ocean, it could be 2 or it could be 4. When we say that the wind does 1 terawatt of work on the ocean, it could be 1 or it could be 2. So there's lots of room in there for other processes that we may not be able to quantify very well right now, such as biological productivity. And so the idea here is, what Dewar et al. Did in 2006 was they had a go at estimating the total amount of energy that is transferred into primary production in the ocean, so from the sun to little critters, all the way up through all of the trophic levels. And they estimated what fraction of that energy is ultimately spent making these little creatures move, wiggle and swim. Because as they wiggle and swim, they can lead to mixing, they can generate turbulence. And so they estimated that around about 1 terawatt is ultimately spent by swimming, by zooplankton, their DL migration up through the picnic line, by things like whales and salmon and tuna swimming around and generating turbulence. And so this is potentially a source of turbulence in the ocean. But we don't really know. It's very difficult to quantify this. So I'm actually not going to talk about it, having just raised it. I'm now going to focus on winds and tides because these are much better studied and they're a little bit better understood. So winds and tides. Winds do 70 terawatts of work on the ocean. The tides, 3.5 terawatts, at a rate of 3.5 terawatts. As I said, the winds, most of that energy goes into surface gravity waves, but around about 1 terawatt goes into the general circulation, 0.1 to near inertial waves. The tides, we care about the 1 terawatt that turns into internal tides in the deep ocean. Now, of that 1 terawatt that goes into the general circulation, this isn't readily available to turbulence yet because it's still on very large scales and turbulence occurs on very small scales. But what has been observed to happen is that when large-scale currents interact with topography, they can generate internal lee waves. And the global estimates for the rate at which internal lee waves are generated is around about 0.5 terawatts. So again, there's a lot of uncertainty in that. Interestingly, lee waves may be able to transfer their energy back into the generating flow. So I have that return arrow. But nevertheless, probably they dissipate a fair amount of energy and generate turbulence where they're generated. So these three processes, internal lee waves, near inertial waves, internal tides, these are all different types of internal waves. Internal waves play a really important role here because they link the large scales at which the ocean is forced to the small scales at which energy is dissipated through turbulence. So each of these internal wave processes can generate turbulence deep in the ocean's interior. And that turbulence, well, some of the energy goes to caloric heating, which has a negligible effect on temperature because the heat capacity of the ocean is so large, but some fraction of that turbulent energy leads to mixing, and it raises the potential energy of the ocean, and it sets that deep stratification that I started the talk by talking about. So what are internal waves? Hopefully you all have some idea, but I thought I would take this opportunity to show this nice movie. So what this is 2 layers of fluid, a light and a dense fluid. It's kind of analogous to what we have in the ocean. We're generating, as the tankers rock backwards and forwards, this is actually a lab experiment by Ed Zaron at OSU. He's rocking the tank backwards and forwards, and he's generating these internal waves that propagate on the interface and can have large amplitudes. Now, these internal waves have a tendency, as I said, to transfer energy to increasingly small scales, to steepen, become nonlinear, and break. And that's why they're so important. So we can think of an internal wave life cycle. So internal waves are generated over topography or at the surface of the ocean when the wind blows. They propagate away. As they propagate away, they can do a number of different things. They can interact with other internal waves that are out there, called wave-wave interactions, and that tends to transfer energy to small scales. They can interact with topography. They can interact with background mean flows, geostrophic currents, eddies. Each of these processes tend to cause the waves to steepen and break and generate turbulence. Eventually, the waves lead to turbulence and mixing, though exactly where and how much is still very much an area of active research. I wanted to show this nice movie to illustrate exactly how these internal waves can lead to mixing, just to kind of tie this together. So actually what you're seeing here is an instability that's growing on a stratified fluid, such as what might happen in the ocean. Internal waves are thought to, one of the ways that internal waves can lose energy is by generating these kinds of instabilities that you're seeing here. And so what you're seeing is that the blue and the yellow, you see these small waves that are formed at the interface. They steepen up and they break, and they look very much like a wave that's breaking at the beach. You can see the yellows and the blues getting mixed together, making an intermediate color. And this is exactly what's happening with density. It's making this intermediate density and leading to ocean mixing in the interior. Okay, so with that, I'd better summarize. So these experiments of Sandström demonstrate that heating and cooling at the surface of the ocean will not by itself generate an overturning circulation. There has to be an external source of turbulence and mixing. And that turbulent mixing in the ocean is thought to be generated by primarily by the winds and the tides, it's not implausible that biology plays a role. Internal waves play a key role in mediating that transfer of energy from the wind and the tides towards turbulence, mostly because of the instabilities in the interactions that they can have and the physical processes that they're subject to. They will fairly readily transfer their energy to small scales and lead to turbulence and breaking, and eventually lead to ocean mixing. Okay, so with that I will end, and I will be happy to answer any questions.